A very good afternoon to all the attendees who have gathered here today for attending this special public lecture, which is being organized by the National Academy of Sciences India Delhi chapter and MHRD-Institution of the Dayal Upadhyaya College under the aegis of the DBT Star College program. Today we have Professor Prof Lockwood with the Space and Atmosphere Group Department of Meteorology, University of Reading, United Kingdom, and we'll be talking about solar magnetic fields and solar irradiance implications for Earth's climate. As a customary, I'll introduce Professor Lockwood, who has BSc and PhD in radio propagation from Exeter University in 1978. After a postdoc in New Zealand, a brief spell at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, and a year at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, he worked for many years in the excellent environment of the Rutherford Appleton Laboratory on the EISCAT radar project to study the aurora and several satellite missions. He eventually served as the chairman of EISCAT's governing council at a time when he built a new radar on Spitzbergen in the Arctic. He was a professor at the University of Southampton before moving to Reading, where he established a new group of exciting young scientists working on all aspects of near-Earth space environment. His research interests comprise, among others, variations in the magnetic fields of the Sun, interplanetary space, and the Earth, and in general, solar influence on global and regional climate. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society of London, Fellow Institution of Physics, Chartered Physicist, Member American Union, Member European Geoscience Union, and a Fellow of Royal Astronomical Society. With these words, I request Professor Lockwood to kindly deliver his webinar.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, good. I'm sorry you can't see me. I happen to use an old computer and the web camera has decided not to work today, whereas it was working quite happily when we tested it 2 days ago. I'm really sorry. Okay, in this seminar, I want to talk about some work that I've been doing with Will Ball. He's a scientist who was at the World Radiation Center at Davos in Switzerland until very recently, but he's just moved to the Technical University of Delft in the Netherlands. Okay, in this talk, I'm going to be talking about solar irradiance, and hopefully I can get the slide. No, I can't make the slide move. Oh, there we go. What I want to do is talk about long-term variations in solar radiance. By that I mean over centuries. The reason for doing that is there are many narratives that link sunspot activity to changes in Earth's climate. In particular, people invoke two things that probably aren't related, but they say they are. That is the Maunder minimum in the solar activity and the so-called little ice age. And one of the points I often make to people was this wasn't an ice age of any shape or kind. In fact, although there was a period where we had more cold winters in Europe at least, the summers were actually hotter at that time. So it wasn't an ice age of any shape or form. And one is really playing around with words of it, semantics, when people use the term little ice age. So I don't like it. It comes from the fact that about 200 years before then, the glaciers around the world in general started to retreat. And that's where the name comes from. But it doesn't, the timing of that doesn't fit well with the sunspot Maunder minimum. So this is why I say actually when you give the link between the Maunder minimum and the little ice age proper scrutiny, it really doesn't stand up. And here's a couple of papers that you could look up. that discuss that. Matt Owens's paper, the first one, is a very scientific look. Mine is a more popularized account that talks about frost fairs on the Thames and things like that, that you see published in Astronomy and Geophysics. And then lastly, the actual material in the talk has just been published in Proceedings of the Royal Society, and there's a DOI reference to it there. Okay. Now, when we talk about solar irradiance, we have to bear in mind wavelength. And I'm mainly going to be talking about total solar irradiance. And that's the total that we get. It's dominated by visible light and heat. So the things that we as human beings rely on. And on the left here, you see a picture of the sun in visible light. It's quite an active sun. You can see a spattering of sunspots. And those of you with very good eyesight, if the link is good, will be able to see some bright areas around the sunspots. I'll talk about them. But on the right, you have the sun as seen in ultraviolet. So this is how the sun would look to a bee if it looked at it, because they see in ultraviolet. And you see around those sunspots, you can see this characteristic shape that exists at this particular time with these bright ultraviolet emissions here, and then a band down here, and actually you can see that ties up with where the sunspots are. Okay. So above sunspots, the solar atmosphere that emits in the ultraviolet, the very lowest part of the atmosphere, what we call the chromosphere, is also bright. Okay. So when the sunspots go up, the ultraviolet irradiance also goes up. And ultraviolet irradiance seems to go up and down with total solar irradiance. Now, there are differences, and the variation, the fractional variation in solar, what we call SSI, solar spectral irradiance, which is normally in the ultraviolet, that is a larger percentage variation than the total solar irradiance, which only varies by about 1/10 of 1% over the sunspot cycle. But it does vary, as you see here, in this composite of various observations, with the sunspot number, which is shown on the bottom here. Well, when we look at temperatures in our atmosphere, so these are plots of, as a function of latitude here from the South Pole to the North Pole, and pressure here, which is essentially height. Okay, so we're going up in the atmosphere as we go up the plot. What you see here is various data sets from various observations, satellite observations. They've been put together through what's called reanalysis, and they're different reanalysis models that are used in the 4 panels. And the red regions are where the temperature has increased over the decades. This is since 2002. And this red area here is red because of global warming. This is the lower atmosphere, the troposphere warming in response to what we call global warming. Now, the important point is that when you get above the stratopores into the stratosphere, which are the areas that are showing up blue here, the temperature has dropped. Now, the stratosphere is warmed by ultraviolet light, and so this cannot be solar irradiation effect, because the stratosphere would be warming with the troposphere if that were the case. The fact it's cooling tells you that what's actually happened is you've trapped in more heat, that you're not letting heat out of the troposphere and up into the stratosphere. That's cooled the stratosphere and warmed the troposphere. This is a characteristic signature of greenhouse gas global warming. Okay, and this is one of the reasons why scientists are totally confident that global warming is not a solar effect, but is actually in the main, a greenhouse gas warming effect. Now, that's not to say the sun doesn't have effects, and we do think that there are particularly not global effects, but there are regional effects, and for some reason, well, for reasons we're beginning to understand, that Europe is particularly susceptible to them, particularly in winter. But there is debate about how much the solar irradiance has changed and therefore what the balance between the two are. I mainly just want to stress that at no point does the balance tip over to being predominantly a solar irradiance effect. It is predominantly a man-made greenhouse gas warming effect. There is no credible scientific doubt about that. But it's still interesting to work out what the sun is doing. And as I say, on a regional basis, it may be doing a bit more than we think, or we have thought. Just to stress that a little further here, the top curve here shows you what we call the global mean air surface temperature. It's the global warming curve. Okay, it's shown as an anomaly, which is the variation relative to a reference period, which is this period in the middle here. And you can see the warming effect that everybody talks about. This shows you, the bottom down here is the sunspot number. This shows you the magnetic field that leaves the sun and enters the whole heliosphere, in which all the planets are immersed. And that's varied, and in a way, quite like the sunspot number, but it doesn't return to the low values. It shows a long-term trend. And these dots here are based on satellite observations. These lines are based on observations of geomagnetic activity, some of it from Mumbai, in fact. And at the middle, the last panel here is the flux of cosmic rays. These were detected by the Oulu detector in northern Finland. These points here are data from there, and then this is a reconstruction based on a model of how the heliospheric field is varied, which in turn is based on these data. And you can see the cosmic rays go down when this sunspot number goes up. And we have these long-term trends in cosmic rays. We have this long-term trend in flux. But if we look at what's happened since about this date here, since the early 1960s, the temperatures on the Earth have continued to rise, but sunspot activity has fallen, the open magnetic flux of the sun has fallen, and that means the cosmic rays have gone up. Okay? That's a bit of a puzzle. If you're going to blame cosmic rays or solar activity, solar irradiance, why in the last 30 years have the temperatures been going in the opposite direction to the sunspot activity? And one of the things that's been suggested, well, just notice here that cycle 24, the one we're just coming to the end of now, is very similar to cycle 14, and yet the temperatures were much lower back in 1900 in cycle 14 than they are now. And one of the things people have suggested said, yes, but look what came before. We had high sunspot numbers before cycle 24, whereas cycle 14 had low sunspot numbers. Maybe that's the difference. And so by including the history of what's happened before the present solar cycle, maybe you could explain it. And that's one of the things we were out to look at, and actually in our Proceedings of the Royal Society paper, we disprove. Okay. The reason we want to look at it is this. This is a reconstruction of the type that is used by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The blue one is made by the Naval Research Labs in Washington, D.C. in America. And the purple one comes from Göttingen, the Max Planck Institute in Göttingen, Max Planck for Solar System Science. And they're different, but they're kind of similar. And this is the value that they're predicting in the Maunder minimum. Okay. But these are two much more extreme variations that have been predicted by invoking a variation in the quiet sun, which neither of these reconstructions allow for. They don't think it's possible. And they come up with these very much larger variations back to the Maunder minimum. This one was the first one by Shapiro et al. Somebody pointed out an error in it, so they corrected it. This is a corrected version by Garova et al. But it's still a very large change. Now, how large? Well, we can equate an irradiance change to a solar climate radiative forcing. How we do that for solar irradiance is that we think about it. Solar irradiance is the power we receive per unit area. Now that's per unit cross-sectional area that the Earth presents to sunlight. And so it's an area of, the total area, catchment area if you like, is pi r squared, where r is the radius of the Earth. Radiative forcing is per unit area, but it is per unit area of the surface of the Earth. And that's 4 pi r squared. So you have to divide the change in total solar radiance by 4 to get a radiative forcing. But then you also have to allow for the fact that some sunlight and heat is reflected back out into space. We call the fraction that's reflected back out into space the albedo. And so what we want is 1 minus the albedo A, and then we have to divide by 4. So we take that and we get the solar radiative forcing. So this change in irradiance from the Maunder minimum to the modern day up here is actually a radiative forcing of about 1 watt per meter squared. Now, although that's smaller than the greenhouse gas radiative forcing, it's still pretty large. It's still considerable. Whereas, and you can see how much larger it would be than for these accepted variations. So what Will and I were doing, well, we're taking a look at this, and what these authors have done is they've used that long-term variability of the sun. What happened over, actually they use a 22-year period before the time in question to actually say that this is the variation. And so that's what we were looking into. We were saying, is that really right? Is it really this big? Okay, and it's an important question. Okay, now we know that magnetic fields, where they thread the solar surface, change the irradiance of the solar surface. And field comes up in these nice loops here between what we call bipolar magnetic regions. It comes out the sun, loops around, goes back in. And that's why sunspots tend to come in pairs, with a positive area where the field's going back into the sun and a negative area where it's coming back out. Where you have a large bundle of flux emerging through the surface like this. By the way, this is a model here of the flux loops emerging out of these sunspots shown here. Where you have a large area like that, you get a sunspot forming. It has a very dark inner region that we call the umbra and the penumbra outside. And so that dims the sun. Okay, so more sunspots you would think would dim the sun, and that's what Herschel, when he first talked about this, assumed was the case. Now let's actually take a close look at what happens. Now what you have here, this is a movie that I've turned into a series of stills so I can run it slowly and talk about it. What you have are a continuum intensity, white light intensity image of the sun on the left. You can see the effect of what we call limb darkening, which is where more of the sunlight has to come through the solar atmosphere and gets absorbed. So we expect that. On the right here, you have a magnetogram. This is sensing, using the Zeeman effect, the magnetic field that is coming in or going out of the sun. And these are these bipolar magnetic regions with, this would be one polarity of sunspot, and here'd be the trailing polarity of sunspot. So you can see them, and then all over the sun you have little flux tubes. We call it salt and pepper because it's black and white in these pictures. Okay. So what I'm going to do is run this movie through. At the top here, I'm going to show you how much the sunspots are darkening the sun and actually reducing the total solar radiance. But then there's something else I'm going to talk about, which is a brightening factor, and that's shown in the top panel here. And then these dark grey and light grey stripes tell us about which side of the sun is facing us. Okay? So each cycle of dark to light is 27 days, which is the solar rotation period as seen from Earth. So if I step the movie on, you can't see anything in the continuum intensity yet. This is a nice quiet period. Why that is important is that there's not much going on, and that lets you identify what causes what. There's lots going on the surface of the sun. You don't know what's causing what, but there's really only one sunspot group in this whole time, and that tells us what it does. So I'm stepping on. There's some magnetic bipolar regions, lots of salt and pepper in the magnetogram, but still nothing to see in white light. Now, as I step on, if you look to the left-hand edge of the left image, oh no, it doesn't appear there. I beg your pardon. Here they come. They appear halfway round a rotation. We see a sunspot group beginning to appear here. And when we look in the magnetogram, we see there is more magnetic field emerging. It's a generally quite active region, but we see this active emerging region. And as the rotation, and suddenly we get a lot of sunspot darkening beginning to form here. Okay, and it rises quite rapidly as that spot group grows. These are images are I think one a day. So now it's about to rotate off, but it's formed a fairly angry active region here on which you can see. We're getting quite a lot of sunspot darkening, but then it rotates off round onto the other side of the sun. We don't see much. Okay, we can see little bits of magnetic field drifting, rotating around, but there's not much until now. And now that group is appearing. Same group, 13 days on, 13 and a half days on, appearing around the other side, right on the left-hand limb of the sun. Over here, there it is. Okay, if I step it on a day, there it is. Okay, you can see it in the magnetogram. The sunspot darkening has gone up, but this other factor, the brightening, has gone up. Now, if I just go back, if you look very closely around the active region, you'll see there is a little bit of brightening. Here's my pointer. Come on, there we go. If you look, oh, stepped on again, I'm sorry. Let's go back. You see the little bit of brightening around here. And these are what we call faculae, Latin for torches. They're little bright spots on the sun. And for every sunspot, there are thousands of these, and they tend to group around sunspots, although they're not exclusively around sunspots. And you tend to see them best near the limb of the sun, as we are now. And as we go across the center, you can't see them anymore. And that brightening, if you look at the top panel here, that brightening has got is less bright again. But as they get near the limb of the sun, it will brighten up again. Now, the sunspot group is actually beginning to wane now. It's beginning to disperse. It's getting bigger. Okay? What actually happens is that these big flux tubes that give us sunspots break up into smaller ones and become faculae. Now, the whole thing is going around the dark again. We've got another very small sunspot there, so small we can hardly see it. Just tracking across the disk there. And as we come around, another one up there, when it comes back round again, here's our active region appearing in the magnetogram. You can still see spots, but not very much, but I can see the bright things around it. So when we look at the effect on irradiance, there's a little bit of darkening now because the spots have waned, but we've got lots of faculae left over. Okay, so what's happened is this has broken up from a tight sunspot group into it's spreading out by diffusion, in fact, into smaller flux tubes. It's breaking up. Okay? You can see that. And you can see how much we're not getting sunspot darkening in blue anymore, but we are getting the facular brightening. In fact, we're almost down to one sunspot now that you can see. And I'll just zoom around the back again. And when it comes back, we don't see any sunspots in that active region, but we still see the leftover magnetic flux. This is an X-sunspot group that's broken up, and it's still causing brightening, as we can see in the top panel there. Okay, and that then carries on around, and that carries on for a while. And this is actually an example where we see an active region like that. Just one, this is 11 years later, and it went round 13 times. Okay, it gave us nice oscillations in just about everything that we received from the sun. The active group re-intensified 3 times, and this was the effect on the total solar irradiance. You see it going round, up and down. It's down when it's around the back of the sun. And then this is the effect on the ultraviolet. And this is the wavelength band that produces ozone, and then heats ozone and heats the stratosphere. And you see it's going up and down with the total solar irradiance in the way that we expect. So the two go together. Okay, I'm not going to talk about the spectral irradiance anymore. I'm going to talk about just the total. This is a closer look. This is from the Swedish telescope on La Palma at these faculae and these little white dots. Okay, you can see they're much smaller than this is a very small sunspot, in fact. And you can see that even the faculae are much smaller than that. And these are active region faculae grouped around sunspots. And one of the problems is that when we look at in a magnetogram, we have a pixel about that size, and a faculum is not, unlike a sunspot, is not going to fill a pixel like that in general. And so we have a filling factor problem. We don't have the resolution in our magnetograms to actually resolve faculae. That's a problem. Now, there's another type of faculae that we see in the lanes between granulation cells. So these white things here, you can see this is where hot plasma is coming up from beneath in the sun, cooling and then dropping back down in these dark lanes. And in these dark lanes, magnetic flux tends to congregate and give you what we call network faculae. And they're spread all over the sun. They don't depend on active regions. So these are movies, but I don't think they're going to play for you today. I'm sorry, system problems. But essentially, here's a typical sunspot with a very dark umbra and penumbra where the magnetic field is slightly laid on its side. And then this is the normal sun boiling away outside where the granules with heat coming up and dropping back down. And when you look near the limb, you can see the depression of because of the cooling of the plasma, because the heat's being blocked by the magnetic field. But you see all around it these bright faculae, lots and lots of them. So what's going on? Well, essentially, the movie is going to run for you now. So you can see the normal granules outside the spot, this dark region. So what's happening is in the convection zone, heat comes up through the convection zone, convects up. But where the magnetic field is large, it interrupts that heat flow, returns some of it back down to the convection zone. Some of it can deflect around, and so we get a slightly bright ring around a sunspot. And so the quiet sun emits that much there, and it's a temperature, an emission temperature about 6050 Kelvin. The bright ring's a little bit hotter effective temperature than that, but not much. Penumbra, where the field isn't vertical, is about is cooler, and then the umbra, the dark bit in the middle, is down near 4000 Kelvin, so considerably cooler. Still very hot, but it's considerably cooler than the quiet sun. Okay. Now, what's a faculum then? A faculum is exactly the same thing as a sunspot. It's just smaller. It's smaller in diameter. And that means that what can happen is that we get the same thing happening. We block the heat coming up where the flux tube is, but we get radiation from the walls, and that radiation can keep the flux tube in hot in there. But because you've got increased magnetic field that has a Maxwell pressure, that means to keep pressure equilibrium, the plasma pressure is lower, and so it's lower density, it emits less. And so we get this what's called a Wilson depression, where the optical depth is decreased. We're seeing emission from lower down. Now, if we look straight down a faculum, in other words, the faculum is close to the center of the disk of the sun, we see the cooler temperature. So faculae are actually dark near the center of the sun. But near the limb of the sun, you can see it's often called the hot walls. They're not hot, they're actually bright. It's higher density, not higher temperature. The whole point is the temperature is the same everywhere. And so they appear bright. And you see that when the faculum is near the limb of the sun, because you're able to see down into see the walls of the well, not just the bottom. Okay? And that's why faculae are bright. What you find is, as I've already said, for every one sunspot, there are thousands of faculae. So the net effect of more sunspots here, higher sunspot number, is that you get a darkening effect, but you get a brightening effect that's almost twice as big because of the presence of faculae. Okay? So faculae are the dominant thing. So when the sunspot activity is greater, the sun is actually brighter, even though the spots are darker. Okay? And you can see, because there's many more of them, it's a smoother variation in faculae, whereas individual sunspots, as they trek across the disk, cause more darkening, cause individual features. Time series. Okay, so we understand all this. Now what we can do is we can take a picture of the sun, a magnetogram, analyze each pixel and say, what is it? Is it quiet sun? Is it network faculae? Is it active region faculae? Is it sunspots? And then apply the relevant brightness temperature, add the whole thing up, and you get the total irradiance. So you have the effective penumbra, umbra here, faculae, and then the quiet sun. You add it all up, the whole disk, and you get the total solar radiance. By the way, here's a magnetogram. The movie's decided to run for you. You can see the magnetic regions around sunspots rotating with the sun. And this model is called SATIRE. It comes out of Max Planck Göttingen, and it stands for Spectral and Total Irradiance Reconstructions based on the magnetic field. And it's extraordinarily successful. Okay, this was a very early version. The correlation between observations and the reconstructions about 0.96. So you're capturing well over 90% of the R-squared variation radiance with this model. So it's a very successful model. I told Sami Solanki, who's the director of the lab there, that calling it a satire model was not wise if he wanted to be taken seriously, but Sami has a very strong sense of humor, so he still calls it satire. Now, what they do with satire is they assume that the quiet sun is constant. Okay, so if we took the observed irradiance and subtracted off the modeled irradiance, then we would get the quiet sun variation. Okay? And that's the technique that Will and I use to take a look at, could the quiet sun be varying as much as those reconstructions implied. So we have to look at, the problem with this is in spotting trends, is the observations don't agree with each other and they have different drifts in them. And the drifts we're looking for are actually quite small. So this is actually an issue. These are various instruments that have flown in space. You have to do this radiometry from space so the atmosphere doesn't mess it up. And absolute radiometry on a spacecraft is a very difficult thing to do. Okay, so it's not surprising the instruments differ. But as time went on, we thought we were getting good because the different instruments started to agree much more than they did early on. And then we came along with a new instrument called TIM on source, and it's quite different. We now think that that's actually, it's been recalibrated and it does it better. So we've got better at it as time goes on. And what we have to do is put these together, because no one instrument lasts that long. They do degrade over time. And composites that have commonly been used, this one comes out of Davos. They largely differ in how they treat this little period here, because what happened here was this instrument was on Skylab and it was brought down by high solar activity and we lost the instrument, ACRIM 1, and it was a while before a special satellite called ACRIMSat carrying ACRIM 2 was launched. So we had to revert to the old instrument on Nimbus 7 here, and that had problems. In particular, the satellite had pointing problems. And one of the big differences between, this composite, the PMOD, and the ACRIM is that the PMOD allows for this pointing direction glitch and ACRIM doesn't. And that's largely why they behave differently. In terms of, you can see the minima has increased between the first and second minima observed. I pointed to what here it is. Okay, so between here and here, ACRIM increases, PMOD doesn't, and the difference is that PMOD allows for a pointing direction. Okay, so this is the problems you have when you try to put the instruments together. More recently, as I say, we've got better, and this is a more recent composite here, and back to about here, everything agrees quite nicely. This is the potential error, but early on there's these larger uncertainties. So in the study, Will and I restricted ourselves to 1995 onwards for a number of reasons. But one of them was that the observations are actually much better. They agree much better, and the drift is problems reduced. The way these work, by the way, is that ACRIM 1 and HF on Nimbus here was just a single instrument, and it was prone to degradation. The way later instruments have worked is they actually have two radiometers, and largely radiometer decay depends on how much you use it. It depends on the coatings in the radiometer cavity, decay and things like that. So if you keep the shutter closed, it tends not to degrade. So what you do is you have two. One you use frequently all the time, and one you use very infrequently. When you do use it, that gives you a calibration point. Okay, so you can calibrate out the degradation in both by knowing the ratio of their usage. Very clever. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why we've improved so much. Okay, so we have this observed sequence. And now we want to go back and say, okay, how can we use this to look at these, and remember these differ largely because of the quiet sun variation that's invoked. And we can take the difference between the data and the model, and we get the quiet sun variation. Now, the way these models were constructed back to the Maunder minimum was to use cosmic rays. Okay, so we used the cosmic ray flux, and what they did was that they looked at the cosmic ray flux. Cosmic ray flux reaching Earth's surface is cut down by three things. It's reduced by the magnetic field in the heliosphere, which is generated, which comes from the sun. It's cut down by Earth's magnetic field, which we know how it varies. Compared to the sun's magnetic field, it varies relatively slowly. It's varying quite fast at the moment by its own standards. And then it's cut down by Earth's atmosphere, and we have to make a correction for that. So what happens is solar wind draws out magnetic field out the sun. It fills the heliosphere. You are here at Earth, that white dot, and irregularities in that magnetic field scatter the incoming cosmic rays. Cosmic rays are produced by supernovae explosions and things like that in the cosmos. We're bathed in a constant flux of them. And because the field is stronger closer into the sun, there's more irregularities. And so these things are like pinballs that are scattered around. But as you see, occasionally one, like this one here, gets through to the Earth. Okay? And the number getting through goes down when the heliospheric field goes up. So that's why cosmic rays are anti-correlated with sunspot number. And that's what those authors use. And we can see that, by the way. Here's a sunspot record. Here we are at sunspot minimum, nice clean sun. And we've got a larger cosmic ray flux. This is seen at Upadhyaya, series taken on later at Hawaii. And then this is the sequence at climax, which is in Boulder. And when we have an active sun, lots of sunspots, we actually get less cosmic ray. Okay? So there's this nice anti-correlation between the cosmic ray flux and solar activity, and therefore the irradiance. Now we have records of how cosmic rays have varied that go back in time. They produce uniquely two isotopes, more than two, but there are two we use a lot. One's carbon-14, and the other's beryllium-10. And they're spallation products. These particles are moving at just about the speed of light. They hit oxygen, nitrogen, and argon atoms in our atmosphere. And the spallation products of those collisions include beryllium-10 and carbon-14. And those are the only sources, just about. About 2/3 of them are produced up in the stratosphere and about 1/3 in the troposphere. And that's true for both carbon-14 and beryllium-10. But then things go, by the way, that's the half-life of carbon-14 and the production rate for cosmic rays, and that's the half-life of beryllium-10. But then things get a bit different. With beryllium-10, what happens, it gets attached to aerosols and it precipitates. And if it precipitates in the form of snow, it gets locked up into an ice sheet. We can drill down into the ice sheet and measure its abundance. And that gives us a record back in time. Up near the top of an ice sheet, like here, you can see these nice striations because the snow gets dirty in summer. So you get a dirty layer and a clean layer into winter. You can count them like counting tree rings. Unfortunately, when you get down, they get so compacted lower down, you have to model the ice sheet to actually date it. And every so often you get a big layer of like Krakatoa dust that you can identify. Like, you know when Krakatoa happened, so we can measure, know that date. We get a calibration point from the volcanic ash layers. So that's beryllium 10. Carbon 14 is different. Carbon 14, like all carbon, takes part of the carbon cycle, exchanged with two big reservoirs, the oceans and the biomass. Some of the biomass, like this is an ancient Bristol cone pine in California, the oldest trees in the world. We drill into them, count the tree rings, again, we're going back in time. Okay? But here we have to use a model for the fact that the carbon 14 is exchanged with the biomass and the oceans. Okay? So modeling what carbon beryllium 10 means is rather more complicated in terms of cosmic ray flux. It's rather more complicated than 10. The other thing, by the way, about because of these reservoirs and the time constants involved, we can only go on really decadal solar cycle timescales for carbon 14, whereas we can get down to annual data. And when we look, these are solar cycle averages, 11-year averages. Here's the sunspot number, two different types, sunspot group number in red, sunspot number in blue. And here's the Maunder minimum. And you can see here, these are 22-year averages of those sunspot numbers, and then comparing it against the cosmic ray fluxes seen from beryllium 10 and beryllium 10 and green. You can see quite an agreement between the two. So these are giving us a record of how the solar magnetic field has changed over centuries, and we can use that through the models that I've been talking about to work out how the irradiance has changed. Okay. I'm going to skip this because I don't really need to explain this. This is explaining how we actually look at the models. This is just again making the point that a nice tight magnetic flux region in sunspots here breaks up into these dispersed facular features over time. And what those long-term variations in the quiet sun invoke is they say that carries on. You no longer see the faculae or the magnetic fields causing them, they're subvisual, but they're still there. So even over a 22-year period, the sun is brighter if there were lots of sunspots 22 years ago. That's the postulate that on which those reconstructions that give the large radiative forcing are based. Okay. Again, this is going back to the model and how we reconstruct back to the model. I'm going to skip that because otherwise I'm going to take too long. What I do want to point out from the model though, so this is the top panel here shows you the purple dots are very accurate cosmic ray flux numbers. The grey is a model reconstruction of them. This is the Dalton minimum here, and this is the end of the Maunder minimum here. If I take a average over 11 years, the long-term variation looks like that in blue. If I take an average over and make it an anomaly with respect to the most recent value, if I take a 22-year one, the variation looks like that. And if I take a 33-year one, the variation looks like that. The point is that the long-term difference between the Maunder minimum and now depends on which number I choose to average over, which was something that the authors of the large radiative forcing variation papers didn't acknowledge. Okay? But it does. It matters what you choose. So one solar cycle, which is the blue line, two solar cycles, which is the orange line. And they used 2 for no reason. Well, they say it was because that was fitted with the resolution of cosmic ray data. So what we've done is we've taken a look over the period where we've got good measurements from satellites of irradiance. And this is the effectively cosmic ray flux, and an average value since about 1995. We use actually something called the modulation potential, but effectively it's a measurement. And then here we have averaged over 5.5 years, 11 and 16, 22 years. You can see the solar cycle is increasingly averaged out, and you just see the long-term trend. Here we have the irradiance data that we use. We have a lot more confidence in them. We can break it up into a facular brightening and sunspot darkening factors in the top panel. This is the PMOD composite out of Davos. This is a composite that we use, which is based on the source instrument and the RMIB SOHO instrument, Meteorology Institute, Belgium, their instrument. So we put a composite together there. And they do vary a little bit in their long-term drift. And that point is made. It's a 27-day. So let's have a look at this drift. Okay, so what we've done here is we've taken the anomaly, the drift relative to the PMOD. We use the PMOD composite as a standard. I have to use one. And there are the various instruments drift by varying amounts. This is an instrumental. We think that this instrument is probably TIM is the best one, but it's drifting relative to PMOD by the amount you can see from the slope. Okay. So different instruments drift by, and these are the two extremes of the potential behavior. Okay. So we're getting a handle. These are quite consistent, but there are long-term drifts. And this must just be instrumental. Different instruments measuring the same thing. So this is telling you about the difference in the drift in the instruments. It doesn't tell you which one is right. It just tells you. Now, when we take the model data, I showed you a scatter plot like this already, showing you how good. This is for the best data we have. Okay, these are daily data. The black dots here are averages over 27 days, and the mauve dots are averages over a year. You can see the model and the data agreeing quite well, but not perfectly. You can see there is a slight difference from the ideal line, which is the dashed line. And that means that's the quiet sun variation. By taking the difference, we get the quiet sun variation. Okay, here's another comparison of a different model, different data. Okay, and we get a different answer. Okay. So what we did was we compared these irradiance drifts, and we get from different combinations of models and data, and we looked at what we get. Now, what's interesting is the model we like most is SATIR 3D. I mentioned that with faculae you have this facular filling factor problem, and that becomes a free fit parameter. In SATIR 3D, what they do is they don't use a free fit parameter, they use modeled facular filling factors. And so actually there is no free fit parameter for the data in the model, which is nice. It's completely independent, but we don't have much of it. Okay. But then notice if we use TIM data, satellite data from source, we get a slight rise in the quiet sun irradiance, whereas if we use PMOD, we get a slight decrease. Okay, and that's the difference between the two instruments. Okay, but that's the nicest model for sure. All the other models have at least one fit parameter to the data, which means that these two halves of this equation for the quiet sun are not independent. Okay, and then we look at the correlation between the cosmic ray flux and that, and we do various studies. We find good peaks at 11 years and 22 years. It varies on the combination we use. Okay, it's a different one, and now this is the significance of the difference between the two. You can see this peak is almost as significant, but it makes a big difference to how you scale quiet sun relative to cosmic ray. Using this, we can put it all together and we get, for individual data and model comparisons, we get curves like this. So this is the maximum possible, minimum possible for modern times. This is the maximum possible, and this is the most likely in black. For this combination, we see hardly any trend. We use the cosmic ray data right back to the Maunder minimum. We see hardly any trend. If anything, the Maunder minimum quiet sun was slightly brighter than it is now. You might expect, because there's no sunspots to darken it, then there's more quiet sun to see. Okay, so that's one possibility. Here's another combination. This is the TIM data compared to the SAT-RS model, the same model. And now we actually see that actually gives us a brighter sun, a considerably brighter sun in the Maunder minimum compared to recent times. By definition, it's zero now. So we're taking the anomaly now. Okay, so it all depends on the instrument you use and drift. So what we did was we took all the combinations, put them together, and there's an obvious factor. For the P-mod, you get these variations here in black, and for TIM and RM IMB, you get these mode with larger values in them. So it depends entirely which data you use. Okay? So essentially, these drifts, these long-term variations, are very dependent upon which data you use. It is in the noise. Okay? The quiet sun variation is down in the noise of your instrument. So, but what we did was we took the average values, we took the existing reconstructions that don't allow for the quiet sun and added them on, and we get these variations from the NRL reconstruction of SAT-R. So we've added the quiet sun, okay, but we have these uncertainties in grey caused by adding the quiet sun. So they still agree, but they have nothing like the long-term drift that we have had before. Okay, so let's wrap up. So what we've done is a detailed analysis of the best data we have for total solar radiance, which is 1995. And it really doesn't support the large change in quiet sun variation that was used in these reconstructions here. So we really find no evidence. And I should say, based on our paper, the Max Planck Institute in Göttingen have done another study, and they kind of agree with this. They find that the sun can't change. Okay. So what we then do, the uncertainties in both the modelled irradiance and the observed irradiance mean that we really can't distinguish, even if the Maunder minimum was dimmer or brighter than today. We really can't say that with confidence. Okay? But we actually find that our best guess is that these have overestimated the quiet sun variation by a factor of about 10. And we've made new reconstructions that actually do allow for quiet sun variation. Okay, I have no idea how long I've been talking because the clock has disappeared from my laptop. But that's it. And I'll hand you back to Gatika to see if you have any questions for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike. There are a few questions. I'll pick up one by one. So the first one is, why the increased activity of the sun, which releases more charged particles, have a strong impact around the northern and southern poles of the Earth?
Okay, that's it's a good question. The answer is Earth's magnetic field. The Earth's magnetic field shields us from incoming particles, and it's harder for them to penetrate down to low latitudes. It's like a mass spectrometer, they get deflected more. And so there isn't a path, there isn't a curvature, a path that allows particles in. When you get to the poles, that's not true. So particles from the sun, what we call SCPs, in the Hitchhiker's Guide, that stands for someone else's problem. But in space physics, it stands for solar energetic particles. But they are someone else's problem. They're a big problem for astronauts. They're very dangerous for humans in space. But those particles get through to high latitudes, and they don't get through to low latitudes. And then the other factor is that not particles, but energy from the sun is used to accelerate particles that are already inside Earth's magnetic environment, inside the magnetosphere. And that's what gives us the aurora. And again, the field lines that map out to where those particles are energized, they map round to a ring near the poles in the aurora. So it's all to do with Earth's magnetic field and the shielding it provides.
Okay, I'll take up the next one. If we focus on the UV irradiance, then does the air pollutants affect the flux? How can you conclude that the effect of air pollutants like aerosols, particulate matter, affect ultraviolet radiation?
That's a very good point, and the question is absolutely right. That there are effects in the stratosphere associated with aerosol pollution in the stratosphere. The measurements that I was showing are taken from space, so well above all that. So they're just what's coming in from the sun, because we're out in space above the atmosphere. The point I was really making, though, is that if you try to say that the heating of the troposphere low down is caused by solar irradiance, then the long-term variation of that would also, if the irradiance has gone up, then the spectral, the UV irradiance would also have gone up. And that would also have produced ozone in the stratosphere and then heated that ozone. So you get, that's why that stratosphere is so hot, relative to just below it and just above it is the ultraviolet light that comes in. So the point I was making is that that unique signature of a warming troposphere and a cooling stratosphere cannot be solar. That's what I'm saying. Okay? However, it is the only mechanism that is predicted to explain that, with the cooling of the stratosphere and the heating of the troposphere, is greenhouse trapping. So that was my point.
Okay. I'll take up the next one. Why intense solar radio bursts occurring in the L band have an impact on the tracking performance of global navigation satellite system?
It's probably I'm I'm not so expert on radio bursts as perhaps I should be, but I think it's because they tend to be associated with eruptions on the sun that produce these solar energetic particles, and they get into particularly at high latitudes and can cause problems in satellites. They can cause problems in satellite electronics. They enhance the D region of the ionosphere, and so they absorb HF radio waves and cause blackout conditions. So it's almost certainly the particles, the energetic particles, that are generated at the same time as the radio. But I should say I'm not an expert on solar radio. I should be. It was the first sign that the sun did these things. It was actually the studies of radar during World War II. There were these strange bursts of noise coming from the sun, but scientists weren't able to pick up on it until peace was restored after the war.
Okay. So the next one is, does the difference in equilibrium between incoming radiations and outgoing radiations from the Earth's surface is the only possible explanation for the greenhouse effect?
Now, you've got to be careful with the greenhouse effect. Earth is remarkably good at maintaining radiative equilibrium. So what happens is we get the sunlight in. The sunlight is the way we heat the Earth, and Earth warms up to radiate enough to actually maintain radiative equilibrium. And all studies show that what has happened is that what the Earth emits back into space very closely matches what it takes in. Okay, so it maintains radiative equilibrium. The way it maintains it is it increases temperature, so it radiates more. Its black body temperature goes up, and that's how the greenhouse effect works. So it's not that there's an imbalance between ingoing and outgoing, it's that the Earth heats up to make the outgoing balance ingoing. That's how the greenhouse effect works.
Okay. How does the temporal and spatial total electron content variations driven by interplanetary space weather conditions degrade the communication systems?
Communications, it increases what we call the error rate. The reason is if the ionosphere stayed nice and smooth, there would be some problems. For example, if you're only using single frequency positioning system, then the error depends on how much on the total electron content. But if you're using double frequency, you can correct for that. And if you're talking about communications, then with if the ionosphere was nice and smooth spatially, then you wouldn't get what we call scintillations. Scintillations are like looking through frosted glass, where you can't see as well because the glass is rough. And so if the ionosphere was smooth, we wouldn't get that. But the roughness does tend to go up when the ionosphere is enhanced in total. So you get more scintillations, and those scintillations cause errors in your transmission. And the only way around that is to reduce the data rate so that the error rate goes down and carry on. So effectively, you can't transmit as fast when you've got high total rate.
Okay, I'll take up the last three questions now. How can we balance or use measures for solar irradiance to make our Earth's climate better?
Well, one of the things, of course, we're aiming at is trying to just understand better. Okay, as I say, there are some effects that do depend on the sun. I personally think the biggest effects are caused by the ultraviolet irradiance, the spectral ultraviolet irradiance in the stratosphere. Now, the thing about the stratosphere is that compared to the troposphere, there's very little of it. It's very sparse, very low concentration. So people say, how can the tail wag the dog? How can this very sparse stratosphere affect the troposphere? I think the reason is that there are large planetary waves that are reflected off the stratosphere. And changing the stratosphere can change those waves, Rossby waves, things like this. And that means that subtle changes in the stratosphere can cause, I think, changes in the troposphere below. And I mentioned that Europe seems particularly prone to this. And I think it's because one of those changes is deflection of the stream. Okay? The jet stream has to pass over the Rockies in the USA, and it meanders quite a lot over America. But it settles down over the Atlantic. By the time it gets to Europe, it's quite prone to being deflected. And what we've noticed is that it gets deflected more often in winter. And the reason for that is that without regular sunlight, the stratosphere has larger gradients. There's a larger gradient in the stratosphere. That allows these effects to be more prevalent. We do see what we call more blocking events. These are meanders in the jet stream, which interrupt the normal warm, moist air that we get off the Atlantic in Europe and bring in cold, dry air from Russia. And in winter, it gets a lot colder. And cold snaps in Europe are always related this and have a very good correlation with solar activity. So we think that my personal view is that that is a viable mechanism, that is working, that there's enough evidence for that mechanism. Other people have proposed other things, and now the latest versions of long-term predictions that are run by the UK Met Office, they allow for that effect. Okay, so what was a research topic 15 years ago when I first published, it into day-to-day forecasts, not day-to-day, but long-term forecasts. And on that point, it's worth noting that for the UK at least, I don't know the stats for India, unfortunately, but for the UK, the weather forecast for 7 days in advance is now better than it was for tomorrow 15 years ago. That's quite remarkable. Okay, it's quite remarkable, and it's the inclusion of science like this that has made that possible. But it's a hard work to gain that advantage. But now, yeah, the weather forecast now for 7 days in advance is about as good as it was 15 years ago for tomorrow. So that's quite something, and it's this sort of science that helps you do that.
Okay. So that comes to the second last question. It has two parts. The sunspot cycle 24 remain weaker, and the upcoming cycle is also predicted to be weaker. So what we expect concerning the TSI in the years ahead, if we are really moving towards a grand minimum again?
Okay, we don't really understand why the sun goes into grand minimum. There are 1 or 2 postulates, but they really, one involves the gravitational pull of the planets, which sounds like astrology, but just because of that doesn't mean we shouldn't take it seriously. But the evidence is not that good for it. It has its successes, but it has its failures too. So we don't really have any physical way of knowing what the sun will do next. We did a study of the past 10,000 years from cosmogenic isotope records, and it's what we call an analog forecast, where you say, well, when was the sun like in a state like it is today in the past and in the run-up to that state, and then what happened next? And we then found that the most likely outcome from that was that cycle 24 would be quite like cycle 23, which it turned out to be roughly true, and that cycle 25 would be quite like cycle 23 too. So that was the most probable answer, but one of the answers at the 90%, 10% level was that we went in cycle 25 into a grand minimum. We really don't know. We have to just try and base it on past experience, and that's not always reliable,
Okay. So the second part is, which of the instruments in your opinion should be referred to while using the TSI data for the past solar cycles and the current one?
Ooh. You know, I'm not sure I have an opinion on that. I'm going to pass on that one. I really don't have an answer for that. So
Okay.
rather than talking nonsense, I'll say nothing at all.
Okay. So that brings to the last question. For training, this is from not many students. So they are asking, for training purpose and for research purpose, from where we can get the irradiance data for last 5 to 10 years.
Yes, no, it is all available online. What I will do is that if you go to the proceedings of the Royal Society paper, the Lockwood and Ball paper. It came out a couple of months ago, maybe a month ago now. At the end of that, the Royal Society insists we list all our data sources. So all our data, including the model data and the observational data that we used, all the web addresses for all those data are given at the end of that paper. So if you look it up, it's open access, freely available online. If people have any problems, then feel free to email me and I'll send a copy. And that lists all the relevant data sources.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike. That will be of great help because I've seen around 30 to 40 students. Well, I would like to share this has been attended by around 250 students and faculty members all across the country. And most of these students, they have really appreciated in the comment section as well as in the chat section. And they have been really enlightened by your talk and about the various aspects of the sun in specific, and which has a wide range of applications because the students are from diverse background ranging from life science to physics to mathematics to electronics. So each one of them, they have tried to put up their questions as per their own technical domain and knowledge. So I would like to thank you. And before I conclude the session, any specific remarks from your side?
No, this has been really nice. I am so sorry that nobody could see me because my camera just refused to work, and I'm using a very old computer because my microphone has failed on my newer computer. So I hope it worked. I'm sorry. Looking at the clock, I think I must have overrun.
Yeah. But no, it was perfectly fine. It was within 45 to 50 minutes. You
Okay,
you've been able to comprise all the
I
things.
had the sense I had to chop some bits out the middle, so I did. But I do apologise if I went on a bit. One thing I will say is that as well as working on solar influences on climate, I do work on solar influences on man-made systems, including satellite communications and electronics and the like, and even aircraft electronics. If at a later date you would like another seminar on that topic, and risk me talking far too long again, then I'd be happy to give you another seminar because
No,
I've
we
really
would love
enjoyed
to.
it.
We would
Okay,
love to
well,
have. We would love to have. So whenever it is convenient to you, in the month of September, you just let me know, and we will
I,
schedule another talk. And it will be a great force of inspiration for all the students, but the budding scientists, they are undergrad or postgrad, and to listen to you and to explore new avenues and areas in which they can work upon.
I'd love to. If you send me an email with a suggested date, we'll
Sure,
fix it.
I'll definitely send you a mail just right away after this.
I was chatting at a good social distance, of course, with a colleague of mine, and I said, "Oh, I can't tomorrow morning. I'm giving a seminar in Delhi." And he said, "Oh, you better rush to the airport then." And so we talked about it a bit. And he said, "Well, how did that come about?" I said, "Well, I got an email, and I thought it was very enterprising of them." And so I said, "Yes." And I think it is, and it's been a nice experience, and I hope people have got something from it, and I'd be more than happy to do another one, which would be quite different, in fact, but I would talk more about things that are relevant to electronics than
Sure,
climate.
sure, sure. Thank you very much, Mike, for expressing your desire to talk to our students and faculty members through this webinar. Although this pandemic has caused a lot of hue and cry all across the globe, but this has also given us an opportunity to interact with speakers whom usually we cannot talk to and listen to in usual times. So on behalf of the National Academy of Sciences India Delhi chapter and the Deen Upadhyaya College, I would like to thank you once again, and I would like to thank all the attendees who have spared nearly I'll say about 2 hours now, and listening to you, asking intriguing questions, and you have been able to answer all the questions to the satisfaction of the attendees, and I can vouch on that on the basis of the comments which I have received in the chat section. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mike.
It's my pleasure, and please pass out my email if people want to email
Sure.
me with questions or can't get that paper I talked about or would like another paper. Then,
Sure.
In fact, my CV, if people Google Mike Lockwood CV, you'll find there's a wrestler, a baseball player, and me.
Yeah, I've seen all that. I missed out introducing you in that respect, but that I've seen all of it. It's all across. So the most versatile person, the CV which I've come across is yours. That I must say.
Okay, there is a Mike Lockwood who's a guitarist who married Elvis Presley's daughter, so people
Yes.
quite often find him. But
So they try to get confused.
Most of my papers are available from the publications page on that CV, so people can download my papers from
Good.
there.
Good.
Good.
Sure. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
I'll get in touch with you very soon.
Pleasure.
Fine.
It's been a pleasure.
Okay.